Hey team, welcome to day 3 of distance learning. Today we're going to link up a little bit. So at home, you're going to do the same thing that we are going to do in school. We're going back to Seedfolks, and I'm going to read to you a chapter that's at the end. It's called From Seed to Seedfolks. All right, it was written in 2002, so it's kind of like an extra chapter. This is an interview with the author. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read along with me because that's important, right? And I'm going to give you the PDF in Schoology, but it's really important that you do that. Otherwise, you're missing the whole point. Okay, you need to have you read while I read along with you. That's how you get fluency. That's how you see words and you learn how they're pronounced. Okay, if you don't do it, you're missing an opportunity. You're wasting your time. You're not growing. Okay, so here we go. So follow along. This is an interesting discussion. This is the author talking about the book and how it came to be. I'm a word person. When I'm eating alone, I need to be reading something, anything. Mere chewing seems idleness. Idleness means like doing nothing. So it was that I found myself 5 years ago between books with no ghost of an idea for the next, having lunch in a bagel shop that, astoundingly, offered no jam-stained, pre-owned copy of the San Francisco Chronicle for those with my affliction. Affliction is like a disease. So he's saying they didn't have anything for me to read. I'm the kind of person that needs to read, and they didn't offer it. They didn't have something there to read. Like the bagel, serendipity is one of my 4 food groups. It's usually closest at hand when farthest from my mind. Serendipity is that idea that things just happen correctly for the right reason, accidentally, like events come together and suddenly, boom, the right thing happens. In mild disgust, I resigned myself to a copy of a New Age tabloid. No sports section, no movie reviews, when something caught my eye. An article about a local psychotherapist who used gardening to help her clients. A psychotherapist is someone who helps people with mental concerns, like depression and whatnot. The story mentioned that physicians in ancient Egypt prescribed garden walks for mentally ill patients. Both my heart and brain began to race. The seed for Seedfolks had been planted. Books don't usually come from a single source. Like rivers, many tributaries flow into them, streams that might have begun running in childhood, along with others no more than a few months old. Each book is its own braiding of waters. Sometimes authors themselves are unaware of what lies behind a book. A veil drops over our eyes when we're writing, shielding us from that realization. It might be lifted when the book is finished, or 5 years later, or never. Throughout my writing life, I've worked on books designed to bring readers together, trying to reproduce the joy and camaraderie of the early music groups and string quartets I'd played in. I'd written books of poems scored for 2 and 4 voices. I'd written books designed for readers' theater groups. Many have grown out of a germ, like the article I happened on that day. So starting with one germ and blowing up into something bigger. I brought home the newspaper, put the article in my file, and wrote a few notes in my idea notebook. But Seedfolks actually had its start many years before. My parents were both dedicated gardeners. In the summertime in Santa Monica, California, I could pick plums, grapes, orange berries, loquats, apricots, figs, tangerines, and never leave my yard. Little by little, my parents had plowed under the front lawn in search of more planting space. We were, and still are, the only house in the neighborhood with a cornfield in the front yard. My father, Sid Fleischman, is a writer of children's books as well. For him, gardening offered a recess break from his study, along with the pride and pleasure of growing one's own food. Often over dinner, he would tally up the number of ingredients that had come from our soil. Writers, like gardeners, tend to be self-taught and value self-sufficiency. That means like writers just want to not need help from anyone else. They write, they do other stuff, they don't need help. And by the way, Sid Fleischman is a famous children's book writer. So if you looked up his name, S-I-D, and then Fleischman, you'll see that he's written quite a bit. I learned to write from my father, but I'm no less a product of my mother, who took her gardening skills into the community. When I was in high school, my mother volunteered as a therapeutic garden in a veterans hospital, showing men who'd served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam how to raise vegetables and flowers, helping to heal damaged psyches in the process. Psyche, brain. The example of my mother's volunteerism was powerful. Over the years, she arranged book giveaways in cash-poor school districts, used her Spanish-speaking skills to tutor students in English, and in her later years, learned Braille so as to translate books for the blind. The conflict between my parents' spheres, the printed page, and the wider world is an ancient one for me. But following my mother's lead, I've tutored foreign language speakers, taught violin and string figures, delivered library books to shut-ins. In an earlier book of mine, a character who's lost her mother vows to keep her alive by becoming her. I found myself doing the same. My own mother died a few years before Seedfolks. She was a large part of the lure of the idea. A book about the healing power of plants would keep her flame lit. Sounds a little like Kim, doesn't it? I'd heard about community gardens, plots of land, usually in large cities, where anyone can grow food and flowers. Such a setting would offer a more varied cast than a therapeutic garden. Women, children, teenagers, people from every corner of the world. I began researching. A marvelous magnetism takes place when an idea for a book takes hold. Newspapers and magazines suddenly seemed filled with references to community gardens. A friend of mine took a job at a local garden for the homeless. Another friend who'd helped found a community garden in Boston made me a tape of reminiscences. I read books, I toured gardens, taking notes. So think about this. He starts working on this book about community garden, and then suddenly this weird thing happens where people he knew and his world suddenly floods him with information about community gardens. That's that magnetism. Stuff just starts to happen. That's also serendipity. And that's happened in my life where I started to think about something and suddenly it starts showing up. I knew immigration would be central to the book. Seedfolks is an old term for ancestors. I'd come across the word many years before and written in my notebook as a possible title. My thought at the time was to collect actual accounts of first-generation immigrants to the United States, those who were the founders of their families here. The book had never come to pass, but the title remained on my list and on my mind. Suddenly, I had a book to go with it. For a writer, the few words of a title can be harder than writing the rest of the book. To have an idea that comes ready-made with a title is like buying a house that's already furnished. That's why you never write titles first. They're so hard. Though my own family had immigrated generations before, one of my mother's relations had been tried as a witch in Massachusetts. Look up the Salem witch trials. I wanted to focus on recent immigrants. This led me to choose Cleveland as a setting, a city famous for its foreign-born population in the past, and now absorbing immigrants from new quarters of the globe. Famous as well for its harsh white winters, Cleveland would be a place with a short summer, where the sight of green would be especially precious. Sounds like Minnesota, doesn't it? Not to be forgotten in the decision were a number of friends of mine who lived or had lived there. Can you see Canada across Lake Erie? That's the sort of question I likely spend weeks fruitlessly trying to track down in books, and the sort that a friend on the phone could answer at once. So this writer chose a place that he could get information from fast, not just researching. He had people he knew. Ideas are everywhere. As my father says, the trick is turning them into something. What would be in the book's shape and story? I decided to concentrate on the garden's first year, like the infancy of a baby or a plant, a time of dramatic growth. I also knew I wanted to tell its history through a variety of characters, each with a distinctive voice. I'd done this in Bull Run, my previous book, an account of the Civil War's first battle told through 16 points of view. The monologues in that book had been very short, each character speaking several times. I have an aversion to repeating myself and wanted something different this time. Longer speeches, closer to short stories, with characters only speaking once, yet appearing in the background of other speakers' accounts, presaging their entrances and following up their exits. So that's what we talked about with Tio Juan. He shows up everywhere. That's what Paul Fleischman is doing, is he wanted only one speaker per chapter, but he wanted to have characters show up. Those characters began taking shape. Some, like sailors awaiting a ship, had haunted my notebook for years, but had never found their way into a book. Others popped up out of nowhere. Research is a wonderful push-pull proposition. You go looking for facts and return with fiction. I read that a few gardens had problems with people raising produce for profit and came up with Virgil's father, the would-be lettuce baron. Baron is like someone who owns like a whole product and sells it. I came across a mention of a support group for teen mothers taking part in a garden and invented Maricela. Say Young came from a newspaper article I'd seen years before about a teacher who'd been assaulted. lost all trust in people, and hadn't left his apartment for years. So you guys see what he's doing? He's pulling from stuff he reads. That's why we read nonfiction. It gives us ideas for stories. Other characters were aspects of me. Sam, who greets everyone he sees, came from the year I spent in an ingrown Omaha neighborhood. Mine was the only beard on the block. Rocks were thrown at me on my first bicycle ride. Like Sam, I began going out of my way to make small talk with grocery store clerks and people at a bus stop, showing them they had no reason to fear me, or, by extension, others who looked different. Write what you know is a common advice for writers. In fact, I'm not much of a gardener myself. I read up on soil and pests and propagation, but it soon became clear to me that the focus of the book was people, not plants. To experience some of what my characters were going through, however, I planted a long row of bush beans in my yard midway through the writing. Suddenly, I understood. I felt pulled out of bed to check on them every morning and gave them a last look every night. Every milestone felt worthy of celebration. The first cracks in the earth, the first sprouts poking through like bird beaks, the first flower, the first bean. I picked off bugs with fierce maternal vigilance and laid an aria of invective on pillaging rabbits. Aria is an opera, and invective, he's really saying he just swore like crazy at rabbits that were trying to eat his seeds. Truly, as Nora says, a garden is a soap opera growing out of the ground. The Vietnam vet who dropped thousands of tiny seeds on his soil to make up for the thousands of bombs he dropped never made it out of my notebook, nor did the alcoholic gardener who spoke to his plants. A book, like a plant, finds its own shape. I feared young adult readers wouldn't sit still for a book about a garden, and for a time I lost faith and put the book aside. When I returned to it, I felt that it had to be shorter so as not to bore my readers and to avoid repeating certain character types. And unlike Bull Run, the book would be open-ended with the outcome of various characters' dramas left to readers' imaginations. The book came out with its lovely jacket and illustrations. Books are quite like seeds. The writer never knows exactly what will come up. Some are yanked out by hostile reviewers. Others please passers-by and spread extravagantly. Like teenagers, successful books move out of the house and take on a life all of their own. Received in distant homes, traveling far, being translated into other tongues. Writers know nothing of these journeys except through fan mail, the postcards sent home by the book. I've followed Seedfolks' progress through these. Like the ancient Egyptians, we recognize that contact with nature can heal. Hours after the 9/11 attacks in New York, scores of people were standing in wait for the gates of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden to open. The city's public gardens waived admission fees and were thronged with those seeking solace and serenity. So think about that. After 9/11, when our country was terrified, the gardens were where people wanted to go. In the uprush of altruism is like doing good, we also saw that a sense of community, that we are known, that we care, that we will be cared for, provides an even greater solace. I sense that we all have hidden stores of generosity that find no outlet except in such moments of disaster. This was the marvel of the community gardens I visited. They were oases in the urban landscape of fear. An oasis is like a magical place different from where you are that offers like something more. They were oases in the urban landscape of fear. Urban means city. Places where people could safely offer trust, helpfulness, charity without need of an earthquake or hurricane. Television, I'm afraid, has isolated us more than race, class, or ethnicity. Community gardens are places where people rediscover not only generosity, but the pleasure of coming together. I salute all those who give their time and talents to rebuilding that sense of belonging. It's a potent seed. Potent means like powerful. I have great faith in a seed, wrote Thoreau. That's Henry David Thoreau. You'll learn about him in high school. Convince me that you have a seed there, and I am prepared to expect wonders. All right, so that's the author. Real quick, just to remind you, a couple things he said. This is interesting. There were chapters that never made the book. A Vietnam vet who dropped thousands of seeds onto his soil to make up for the bombs he dropped. Think about that. Like, he went to war and he killed people. And this community garden is trying to help him like recover some of that. But that never made it into the book. We didn't get that chapter. Same thing with an alcoholic gardener who talked to his plants. We didn't get that either. So There's stuff that never made it into the book, and we're going to hold on to that because you are going to do some writing related to this. Stand by. I'll give you that in a little bit. So first of all, go on to the next activity.